They took his grandfather's land. They left him a parking lot full of weeds. They laughed while they did it. Then a torch cut open a welded box. A brass key turned in a drawer nobody had opened since 1998. The county's biggest developer found out he'd spent 4 years selling land he never owned. And then Caleb started digging. But before the digging, there was the auction. The auctioneer laughed before Caleb even raised his hand. "Son, you sure you want to bid on a parking lot full of weeds? Nobody's parked there since Clinton was president." Caleb Winters didn't laugh back. He didn't say anything. He had $400 folded in his jacket pocket. All of it. Every dollar he had. He raised his hand anyway. Behind him, 2 men in clean jackets snickered into their coffee. Roy Danby's men. Everybody in Piney Fork knew Danby's men by their boots. Boots that had never once stood in mud that mattered. Caleb was 26. He slept in a 2009 Ford Ranger. Windshield cracked clean across like a spiderweb in ice. He worked roofing jobs when a crew would take him. Some weeks every day. Some weeks none. He had $31 left after this bid closed. A half tank of gas. A grandfather 11 weeks in the ground. Everybody else wanted the timber lot. Or the 2 rental houses on Route 9. Or the 78 Bronco up on blocks in Wendell Winters. Side yard. Nobody wanted the drive-in. 12 acres of cracked asphalt. Gravel gone to seed. A screen tower leaning 4 degrees off true. A concession stand with the roof half caved into the kitchen. The county tax rolls had it at $900. Even the will just called it the drive-in property. Like the lawyer hadn't wanted to waste more ink on it. $400, Caleb said again. Louder. So the auctioneer would stop scanning the room for a better bid. Nobody raised a hand against him. Why would they? He'd have paid $4,000 if he had it. Everyone there knew he didn't. Everyone there figured that made him the fool in the room. The gavel came down. A woman 2 rows back said, just loud enough to carry, "Boys inheriting weeds and calling it a win." A few people laughed. Caleb kept his eyes on the auctioneer's hand as it moved to the next lot. Looking at any of them would have cost him something he didn't have to spare. He'd visited Wendell every Sunday for 6 years. 40 minutes each way. Gas money scraped together from odd jobs. Sometimes he brought nothing but a bag of peppermints from the Dollar General, because that's what Wendell liked during the ball game. Not one cousin made that drive more than a handful of times. Total. Not one of them sat with the old man that last winter, when his hands shook too bad to hold a fork. Caleb learned to cut his food small enough that Pride didn't have to notice. That same morning, before the auction, a crew boss on a barn job near London, Kentucky told the crew to skip the harness check, said they were behind schedule, said the roof wasn't that steep. Caleb checked his own harness anyway, twice. Then he checked the new kid's harness, twice. The kid was 19. He didn't know yet that $15 extra wasn't worth what a bad fall could cost him. Caleb turned down the $15. He always turned down the corners other people tried to cut on him. Piney Fork sat off Route 9, deep in the eastern Kentucky hills. One blinking light. A Dollar General that doubled as the town's social centre most weeknights. The drive-in sat 2 miles past the Piney Fork Baptist Church, up on a rise the old-timers still called Kessler Hill. Nobody under 60 could tell you why anymore. Caleb drove out there that same evening. Windows down because the AC died back in March, along with the last of his savings. He parked in his own gravel lot. It still felt like somebody else's joke. He sat there until the sun dropped behind the tree line, and the screen tower's shadow stretched long and crooked over the weeds. He didn't have anywhere else to go. He didn't put that into words. He just knew the truck's bench seat, reclined flat, was where he was sleeping. Same as most nights that month. Except this time the gravel under the tyres belonged to him. Around midnight, a raccoon got into the old concession stand through a gap under the door. The racket woke him. He climbed out of the truck, more out of habit than nerve, grabbed a tire iron from the bed, and went to chase it off. The front door hung crooked on one hinge. Inside it smelled like 30 years of rot and mouse droppings, and underneath that, faint like the ghost of scorched popcorn. He didn't find the raccoon. It was already gone, but his flashlight beam swept the little side room, the old projection booth, and caught on something that didn't belong. A sheet of plywood nailed over what should have been solid wall. The nail heads were shinier than everything around them, like they'd been driven in years after 1994, not decades. He stood there a long moment, tire iron still in hand, told himself it was nothing. Old buildings had patch jobs, That's all this was. He didn't believe it. Some part of him, some part that had learned patience the hard way, told him it could wait until morning, when the light was better, when he wasn't running on 4 hours of sleep and a bag of gas station peanuts. He was wrong about that. It couldn't wait, not really, not once he'd seen it. But he walked back to the truck anyway. He lay there a long time before sleep took him, thinking about his grandfather's hands, how steady they used to be, before the shaking started, how they worked a wrench or threaded a film reel, like the motion was carved into the bone. Morning came grey and wet. Caleb was up before 6 out of old habit. He stood in the gravel lot, a cup of gas station coffee going cold in his hand. A truck he didn't recognise came slow up the drive. An old green Chevy, rust creeping along the wheel wells, moving like the driver already knew the way. The man who climbed out was 71, if he was a day. Flannel shirt buttoned to the throat, despite the June heat. He carried a thermos under one arm, like he'd brought it on purpose. He looked at Caleb, looked at the leaning screen tower behind him, and nodded once, slow. The way men in this county nodded when they'd already decided something before they opened their mouths. You'd be Wendell's grandson. Not a question. I'm Vernon Task. Played cards with your grandfather every Thursday night for 20 years, right up until his hands got too bad to hold them proper. He held out the thermos. Figured you could use coffee that didn't come out of a machine. Caleb took it. Mostly manners, not thirst. He studied the old man's face for the punchline everyone else in town seemed to carry around about this place. He didn't find one. Everybody else thinks I got skinned, Caleb said. Vernon almost smiled. One corner of his mouth moved, then thought better of it. Everybody else didn't know your grandfather. He looked past Caleb, at the plywood-patched building, and something sharpened in his eyes, some old attention, waking up after a long sleep. Wendell used to say a strange thing to me. More than once. Right at that card table. He'd say the screen was never the point, boy. Said it like a joke half the time. But Wendell didn't waste breath on jokes that weren't also true. Something cold moved down the back of Caleb's neck. Nothing to do with the morning air. He thought about the plywood panel, the 2 shiny nails. He didn't mention either yet. Some instinct told him not to hand a stranger everything he'd found before he understood it himself. He say what he meant by it? Caleb asked instead. Vernon looked at him a long moment. Coffee steam curled up between them in the wet morning air. Something careful sat in the old man's face. Something that looked almost like relief that somebody had finally asked. No, Vernon said. But I've had 40 years to wonder. And I think this might be the week we find out. Vernon didn't leave after the coffee. He set the thermos on the tailgate, rolled his sleeves past the elbow and said, Well, show me this panel you're not telling me about. Caleb hadn't said a word about the panel. He looked at the old man a long moment. Vernon just shrugged, unbothered. Like he'd read it plain off Caleb's face, the way you'd read a gas gauge. You've got the look of a man who found something and hasn't decided what to do with it yet, Vernon said. I've known that look on other men. Your grandfather wore it most of his life. They went in together. The projection booth smelled like dust and old machine oil. The one grimy window let in just enough light to catch the plywood panel's new nail heads, glinting like something deliberate. Caleb set his fingers against the edge and pried. It came away easier than 30 years of weather should have allowed, like it had been set to be found, not to last. Behind it sat a metal filing box, grey steel. The kind a small business used in 1974. Rusted latch, but not seized. Vernon made a sound low in his throat. Half laugh, half held breath. He crouched down slow, joints complaining, until he was eye level with it. Well, I'll be, he said quietly. He really did it. Did what? Kept the paper trail. Vernon looked up at Caleb, and for the first time all morning his calm face cracked a little. Your grandfather ran this place 31 years, boy. Never threw away a receipt. Not one. If something's worth finding, it's in a box like this. Under a stack of yellowed real rental invoices and unpaid tax notices going back to 1991, they found a smaller lockbox, welded shut along every seam. No keyhole, no hinge. Lunch pail size, but it weighed like it held something solid. Not paper, something with heft. He welded this shut, Caleb said, turning it over in his hands. Why weld a box shut? Anybody could just cut it open. Anybody with a torch, Vernon said, and anybody who knew whose torch to ask for. He turned it over, thumb running along one seam. I know this box, or I know the man who made it. There's a fella 2 counties over, machine welder, retired now, keeps a shop. Wendell used him on the projector housing years back. If anybody can cut this clean, it's him. The tax notices told their own story. $900 a year, and Wendell let 3 years lapse before catching up all at once, like he was scraping together whatever he had. Rather than let the county take a real interest in a property he badly wanted people to think was worthless. Caleb sat with that a while, turning the welded box over and over, thumb finding nothing on the seam. By mid-morning, a black pickup came up the drive, paint too new for these roads. A man got out who didn't belong to weeds and gravel, not the way Caleb and Vernon did. Roy Danby was 54, built solid through the shoulders, the way a man gets when he used to do his own lifting, and now pays somebody else to do it. Collar open at the throat like he'd dressed for a golf course and ended up here instead. Caleb Winters. Danby said the name like he was trying it on for size, finding it small. Didn't expect to see you out here so quick. Most folks in your position are still sleeping off the shock. Morning, Roy, Vernon said. Flat, no warmth in it. Danby's eyes flicked to the old man. Something passed behind them. Quick, calculating. Then back to Caleb. I'll get right to it. I've got a meeting in Lexington by 2. I'll give you $11,000, cash today for this whole junk heap. That's 10 times what the county says it's worth. More than the scrap value of that screen tower alone. You'd be a fool to say no. That's a real generous number, Caleb said, for a parking lot full of weeds. Something flickered across Danby's face. The phrase had landed somewhere it wasn't supposed to. It's not generous, Danby said. It's practical. That access road's coming up for a county safety review next month. Decent chance it gets condemned as substandard. You'd be sitting on land you can't legally reach. I'm doing you a favour. I'll think about it, Caleb said. As far from yes as he could make it without saying no outright. Some instinct told him not to hand Danby a flat refusal, not until he understood what the man was so eager to buy. Danby's jaw worked once. He smoothed it over fast, the way a man does when he's spent a career not letting his face show what his money was thinking. Don't think too long, he said. Offers like that don't repeat. He got back in the truck without another word to Vernon. Tires through gravel on the way out. More temper in it than the moment called for. Vernon watched the truck go. Arms folded. $11,000, he said, for a junk heap he just called worthless to your face. That's the kind of arithmetic that doesn't add up. Not unless a man already knows something you don't. Caleb didn't know yet about the pre-sale letter sitting in a Lexington filing cabinet. Didn't know the number on it. Didn't know about the 60 adjoining acres Danby had spent 4 years quietly buying from Kessler Cousins who thought they were selling worthless scrub. He didn't know any of the specifics, but he knew this much. Standing in that lot, welded box in his hands, Danby's dust still hanging in the air, somebody in this deal was lying about how little this place was worth. And it wasn't him. I need money for the torch cutter, Caleb said. The one you mentioned. I know a barn roof outside Barberville needs shoring up before the week's out, Vernon said. Owner's decent, pays fair. I could put in a word. 3 days on that roof. Before dawn until the light gave out. June heat that soaked his shirt through by 9 in the morning. $60. That's what the welder charged to cut the box clean. Caleb drove there straight from the job, still in his work clothes, sawdust and grit under his nails. He stood in a shop that smelled of hot metal. An old man with forearms like cable wire ran a thin blue flame along the seam Wendell had sealed decades before. The lid came free with a small hiss, like the box itself finally exhaled after 40 years holding its breath. Inside sat a brass key, small, old-fashioned, taped flat to a yellowed index card. On the card sat 6 words and a number, block print. The same careful hand his grandfather used labelling film canisters. Caleb knew it instantly. Drawer 14. Old records. Annex. Ask Vernon. Caleb stood under that bare bulb a long moment, key warm from his own palm. Something shifted in his chest, something he didn't have a name for yet. His grandfather had known this moment was coming. Built toward it, patient as a man laying brick, years before Caleb ever needed it. Vernon, he said, out loud, to no one, testing the shape of it. He knew you'd be standing next to me when I found this." The old welder, not looking up from his tools, said only, "Your granddad was never a man who left things to chance, son. Whatever's behind that drawer, he wanted somebody there who'd know what they were looking at." Those same 3 days, on a different job entirely, Caleb had learned something else about himself. Nothing to do with the box waiting behind the plywood. It happened the same morning as the auction. Before any of this started, a barn roof outside London, Kentucky, a crew boss named Gary Combs told the whole crew to skip the harness check, said they were running behind, said the pitch wasn't steep enough to matter. Caleb checked his own harness anyway. Buckle, strap, anchor point. 3 points. Quick and quiet. The routine an older roofer taught him years back. That roofer had fallen 11 feet off a lower pitch once. Broke his hip bad enough he never worked a roof again. Then Caleb walked over to the new kid, a 19-year-old named Dustin Farley. Nervous the way a man gets when he needs the paycheck more than he trusts the gear. Caleb checked his harness too. Thorough. Unhurried. Ignored Gary Combs whistling impatient from across the roofline. "Rig's fine," Caleb told him. "But clip that anchor again before you lean back. I've seen it slip on this exact model when the housing's old." Dustin clipped it again. Nothing happened that morning. No dramatic near miss. But Gary Combs docked Caleb $15 off the day's pay for slowing the crew down. Caleb took the deduction without complaint. Like the $15 had never really been in question, next to what those extra 90 seconds bought. He didn't know it yet, but that same habit, checking what other people were willing to rush past, was about to matter more than $15. Before the annex, there was one more thing in that filing box. Vernon found it actually tucked in its own manila sleeve, separate from the tax notices. A single sheet, dates and dollar amounts, in Wendell's own careful block print. No explanation attached. Vernon turned it over in his hands, in the projection booth that first morning. He went quiet a while. "This is a debt ledger," Vernon said slowly, "but not money owed to your grandfather. Money he was paying out." He ran a finger down the column. 1978, $300, marked just RF. Then again in 81, then 84. He looked up. "I think your grandfather was paying somebody's medical bills. Or a mortgage. Something recurring. Something private. 20 years near enough." They never fully proved who RF was. Vernon had a theory, though. A projectionist Wendell once employed. A man named Russell Farmer. He'd lost the use of one hand in an accident with the old carbon arc equipment sometime in the early 70s. Never worked steady after that. If Vernon's theory held, Wendell had spent 2 decades quietly supporting a man hurt on his own property. Never mentioned it. Not once. Filed the payments away in a ledger nobody was ever meant to find. Not unless they went looking for exactly the kind of secret Wendell Winters specialised in keeping. "He wasn't broke," Caleb said, turning the ledger page in his hands, doing rough math against the dates. He was giving it away. On purpose. For years. "Your grandfather believed $1 sitting in an account doing nothing for anybody was $1 wasted," Vernon said. "He'd have told you himself plain if you'd asked him. Money was a tool for taking care of people. A man who stockpiled past what he needed was just hoarding a tool he wasn't using." He folded the ledger back into its sleeve. Careful. The way you'd handle something fragile. I expect that's part of why he built the deed the way he did too. Not to make you rich for its own sake. To make sure you had a tool in your hand when you finally needed one. That thought came back to Caleb more than once in the months that followed. The old county records annex sat 2 blocks off the Piney Fork Square. Squat brick building. Plywood over half the windows. Locked since 1998, when the county moved its filing operations into the new courthouse annex and never got around to tearing the old one down. Vernon walked Caleb to the county clerk's office first, not the annex. Vernon had spent 40 years believing in doing a thing the right way, before he did it the fast way. The current clerk, a woman named Patricia Ordway, had inherited the job from Vernon himself. She listened to the whole story, arms crossed, eyebrows climbing. "You're telling me there's an active deed sitting in a drawer in a building the county forgot it still owns," she said. "I'm telling you I filed it myself in 1974, Vernon said. "Old parcel numbering. Never migrated when they digitized in the 90s because nobody flagged it. It's not lost, Patricia. Just old." She studied Caleb a long moment. Then she reached into her desk and came out with a ring of keys, brass gone dull with disuse. I can't authorize anything based on a drawer number. And a dead man's key, she said. But I can let you look. That building, and everything in it, still belongs to this county. I'm this county's clerk. I say we go look. The annex smelled like every closed place smells after enough years. Dust gone soft and organic, mildew creeping up through the floorboards near the back wall, where a roof leak had gone unrepaired since before Caleb was born. Rows of steel filing cabinets stood in the dark, like sentries nobody had relieved from duty. Patricia found the light switch more from memory than expectation. Half the fluorescent tubes buzzed weakly to life, casting a sick yellow glow over everything. Drawer 14 sat in the third cabinet from the back wall. Vernon walked straight to it, like his feet remembered the path better than his mind did. The brass key from the lockbox slid into a small lock at the top of the cabinet. It was meant to secure the whole unit, not a single drawer. It turned with a grinding reluctance before giving way. Inside drawer 14, among 24 brittle folders gone the colour of weak tea, sat one marked in faded ink. Winters W. Kessler Hill Tract, 1974. Vernon lifted it out with both hands, like it might crumble if he wasn't careful. It very nearly did. He carried it to a dust-caked table under the buzzing lights. Unfolded the deed, brittle paper cracking faintly at the old fold lines. He smoothed it flat under the bare bulb. Caleb saw his grandfather's signature first. Same careful block print from the index card. Formal here, though. Notarized. Dated in a hand that had once been steady. Beneath it ran a legal description. Lot numbers, meets and bounds. Language Caleb couldn't fully pass. But Vernon's finger traced down the page and stopped. His whole hand went still. There it is, Vernon said. Voice gone rough. The drive-in parcel. And right here, bundled into the same tract, 62 acres running east along Kessler Hill. All the way to the county line. 62, Caleb repeated. The drive-in's only 12. Because that's all the county's digital records show, Vernon said. This deed predates digitization. When they built the modern parcel system in the 90s, somebody split this tract on paper into what they could see standing on top of it. The 12 visible acres. The screen. The concession stand. But your grandfather never resurveyed it, never subdivided it. Legally on this document, the one that's still valid, it was always one tract, 62 acres. All of it his, all of it now yours. Caleb stared at the page, at his grandfather's signature, at the date. October 1974, he did the math without wanting to. Danby had spent 4 years quietly buying up parcels from Kessler cousins scattered across 3 states, each of them believing they were selling a separate, clean piece of scrubland nobody wanted. If this deed was still good, every one of those purchases was built on a fiction. Danby didn't own clear title to any of it. He'd been selling promises on land he never actually held free and clear. Why didn't you ever tell anybody? Caleb asked. It came out harder than he meant. 40 years of a secret, sitting heavy between them in that dusty room. Vernon didn't answer right away. He set both hands flat on the table, either side of the brittle deed, and looked at it a long moment before he looked up. Because your grandfather asked me not to, he said. 1974. The week after I filed it, he sat me down at that same card table we always played at. Told me, plain, he didn't want this coming out until somebody in his family needed it more than they needed the money. Said money finds people who don't need it more often than it finds people who do. He wasn't going to let that happen to this. He made me promise. 40 years, Caleb. I've sat on that promise wondering every one of them if I was doing right by him, or just being a coward with a secret. And now? Now I look at you, Vernon said, sleeping in a truck with a cracked windshield. And I think your grandfather knew exactly what he was doing when he waited this long. Caleb sat down hard in one of the annex's old wooden chairs. The deed lay between them, under the sick yellow light. For a while neither of them said anything. A pipe ticked somewhere in the walls, contracting in the June heat. Patricia Ordway stood a respectful distance off, giving them the room they needed. He used to tell me the screen was never the point, Caleb said finally. I thought it was just something old men say. It's the truest thing he ever told anybody, Vernon said. The screen was what people looked at while they parked their cars on top of the point. All those years, all those Friday nights, folks paying to watch a movie. None of them had any idea they were sitting on 62 acres. Their own county couldn't even find in its own system. Patricia finally spoke. Careful, official. Even in a dust-choked annex, nobody had entered in years. I need to photograph this deed and get it into evidence before anything else happens to it, she said. And you need a lawyer, Mr. Winters. Today. Not next week. Because if what I think is happening out there on Route 9 is happening, somebody is racing a clock you don't even know exists yet. She was right to worry. That same afternoon, 40 miles away, Roy Danby sat in a Lexington office tower with his own attorney, reading a filing his people had rushed through that morning. An emergency petition asking the county to expedite an eminent domain review on the drive-in's access road. Safety and blight concerns. Time to close before anyone could contest the underlying title. Danby didn't know yet about Drawer 14. Didn't know a brass key had turned that morning. Didn't know a woman who used to file his paperwork by hand now held the deed that undid 4 years of his careful, quiet work. But somewhere in the back of his mind, a small cold worry had started. The part of him that had built a career reading rooms and reading people. Ever since that boy in the gravel lot looked him dead in the eye and said he'd think about it. Men with nothing to hide didn't say they'd think about it. They said yes to $11,000 and never looked back. Danby signed the emergency petition anyway. Sometimes the only way through a bad feeling is to move faster than it can catch up to you. The days between the annex and the hearing stretched longer than a week has any business stretching. Caleb spent most of them learning things about his own grandfather, things he'd never had reason to ask about, while the old man was still alive to answer. Denise Corbin wanted every scrap of paper that could corroborate the 1974 filing. That meant Caleb and Vernon spent 3 straight afternoons back in the dusty annex, working through drawer after drawer of records nobody had touched since the Clinton administration, hunting down anything that referenced the Kessler Hill tract by its old parcel number. It was slow, filthy work. Cardboard boxes gone soft with damp, mouse nests tucked into corners of drawers that hadn't been opened in a generation. More than once Caleb came up from a stack of folders, hands black with old dust, eyes burning from the must of it. But in among the tedium, they found things that had nothing to do with the deed itself, things that had everything to do with the man Wendell Winters had actually been. A stack of receipts showed he'd quietly paid the property taxes on 2 other Kessler cousins' parcels during a hard winter in the early 80s, never asked to be repaid, never told anyone he'd done it. The transactions surfaced now only because the county's own ledger happened to note the payer's name in a column nobody had thought to redact. A folder of correspondence with the Projectionists' Union showed something else. Wendell had once organised a fund among 3 counties' worth of drive-in owners to cover a colleague's hospital bill after a bad car wreck. An act of quiet collective generosity that never made it into any obituary or eulogy. He never once mentioned any of this, Caleb said, holding one of the union letters up to the annex's weak fluorescent light. Not once in 6 years of Sunday visits. That was Wendell, Vernon said, not looking up from the drawer he was working through. The man built his whole life on one theory. A good deed loses half its value the moment you tell somebody about it. Drove me half crazy some Thursdays, playing cards with a man who'd quietly fixed somebody's roof that same week. Wouldn't say a word about it, unless you dragged it out of him with pliers. Caleb thought about the $60 under his own windshield wiper, the shaky cursive note. He understood then that Vernon hadn't inherited that habit so much as caught it, the way you catch a cold from spending too many Thursday nights across a card table, from a man who lived that way as a matter of principle. They also found, buried near the back of one drawer, an old photograph, black and white curling at the corners. The drive-in on what must have been its opening night sometime in the early 60s. Cars parked bumper to bumper across the lot. It looked, in the photograph, almost exactly like it looked the night of the reopening, 30 years later, except the screen tower in the picture stood perfectly straight, freshly painted. A much younger Wendell Winters stood beside it in coveralls, grinning at whoever held the camera, one hand resting flat against the tower's base, like he was steadying something he'd built with his own 2 hands, intending to keep it steady for as long as he had breath to manage it. Caleb kept that photograph. It went, eventually, into a plain wooden frame he built himself, out of scrap lumber from the concession stand renovation. It hung, once the snack bar was finished, on the wall just behind the register, where anybody buying a bag of popcorn could look up and see the man who'd started all of it. 30 years before anyone thought to laugh at a grandson for buying his weeds. The nights were harder than the days that week. Caleb still slept in the truck most of them, not because he had nowhere else. Vernon had offered his spare room more than once, but something in him wasn't ready yet to leave that gravel lot unwatched. Not with Danby's men circling, and an emergency petition sitting on the county's docket like a lit fuse nobody had cut yet. He'd lie there in the dark, windows cracked for what breeze the June nights offered, running through everything Corbin had walked him through that day. The language of easements and clear title and adverse possession. Words that meant nothing to him 2 weeks earlier. Now they sat in his head like tools he was learning to use for the first time. One night, close to midnight, he heard a vehicle slow on the road below the rise, headlights sweeping briefly across the tree line before continuing on. His whole body went rigid, waiting to see if it would turn up the drive. It didn't. Just a truck heading somewhere else entirely. Some rancher checking a fence line, or a teenager taking the long way home. But Caleb lay awake another hour after that, listening to the particular quiet of a piece of land. One that had, for the first time in a long while, something worth somebody else wanting. Badly enough to come looking for it in the dark. He mentioned it to Vernon the next morning, half embarrassed at how jumpy he'd let himself get, over a truck that turned out to belong to nobody in particular. Vernon didn't laugh at him for it. "You're guarding something now," Vernon said simply. "First time in your life you've had something worth guarding. That feeling doesn't ease up just because the thing you're guarding turns out to be legally yours. Took me the better part of a year, after I filed that deed back in '74. Before I stopped checking over my shoulder every time I drove past this hill." He handed Caleb a fresh cup from the thermos, steam curling into the morning air, same as it had the very first day. It gets quieter. Not gone, quieter. The lawyer Patricia sent them to was a woman named Denise Corbin. She kept an office above the pharmacy on the Piney Fork Square. 22 years handling wills, deeds, and the occasional ugly property dispute for people who couldn't afford the fancier firms in Lexington. She read the 1974 deed twice, slow, pen tapping an unconscious rhythm against her legal pad. When she looked up, her face had the flat, careful look of a woman doing arithmetic she didn't like. "This is either the best morning of your life or the start of the worst week of it," Corbin said. "Possibly both. If this deed is what it looks like and Vernon's filing checks out, you're not looking at 12 acres worth $900. You're looking at 62 acres a developer's already agreed, in writing, to sell for $2.1 million. Problem is, he agreed to sell land he doesn't actually own free and clear. He doesn't know that yet. Men in that position move fast. And sloppy. "He already filed something," Caleb said. "This morning, before we even left the annex," Patricia called. "Emergency petition. Eminent domain. The access road." Corbin's mouth thinned. That's not a coincidence. That's a man who felt something shift, racing to close before the ground under him gives way. "We need a title hold filed at the courthouse today. This afternoon. Before his petition gets a hearing date. And we need every scrap of paper Vernon can put his hands on, backing the deed's validity. Danby's lawyers will come at this hard. Fraud, forgery, anything to keep 62 acres worth $2 million out of a 26-year-old roofer's hands. They filed the title hold that same afternoon. Corbin walked the paperwork across the square herself, rather than trust it to the mail. For the first time since the estate sale, Caleb slept that night with something other than dread sitting in his chest. Not hope exactly. Closer to the feeling of finally standing on ground that held. 2 mornings later, Caleb found a plain white envelope tucked under the ranger's windshield wiper. No stamp, no name, just his first name in a shaky, careful hand across the front. Inside sat $60 in worn bills and a folded note. Sunday suppers, paid forward. W.T. Caleb sat in the driver's seat a long while, turning the note over, trying to place the initials. Wendell's own, he thought at first. Foolishly. Then the arithmetic caught up with his grief. A dead man doesn't leave cash under a windshield wiper. He asked Vernon about it that afternoon. Showed him the note across the hood of the truck. "W.T.," Vernon said slowly. "That's not your grandfather's hand," Wendell wrote in block print. "Always. Even his grocery lists. This is cursive. He didn't say anything else for a moment. Something complicated moved across his face. Your grandfather used to slip me grocery money, Caleb. Quiet. Every few weeks. For years. Back when my wife was sick and the medical bills were eating everything we had. Never made a show of it. Just left an envelope in my mailbox some Thursdays after cards. I never once thanked him properly. He never let the conversation get that far. Told myself for years I'd pay it back somehow. Things never quite eased up enough. Then he died. I figured that debt just went unpaid forever. You're saying that's you, Caleb said. The envelope. Vernon's jaw worked once. I'm saying a man doesn't get many chances to close an old account, he said. And I had $60 I could spare. And a truck. And I know where you sleep at night. Wasn't hard arithmetic. Caleb didn't know what to say to that. For a while he didn't say anything. The drive-in's crooked screen tower threw its long shadow between them. Something settled into place that had nothing to do with deeds or dollar amounts. The following week brought Danby back. This time he didn't come alone. 2 men in suits climbed out of a second car behind his truck. Caleb recognized the posture of lawyers before either of them said a word. That particular stillness men carry when they're paid by the hour to look unbothered. We're aware of the title hold, Danby said. No pretense of friendliness left. I want to be clear with you, son, because I don't think anyone else has been. That deed's 60 years old, filed under a system nobody uses anymore. There's a real chance a judge looks at it and calls it an antique with no legal force. You could spend the next 2 years every dollar you don't have fighting this, and lose anyway. I'm offering you one final time a clean number, $20,000. Today, you walk away with more money than you've probably ever held in your life. 20,000, Caleb said. That's near double what you offered last week. Something flickered behind Danby's eyes. Quick! There and gone. The tell of a man who'd just revealed more urgency than he meant to. Consider it a courtesy, Danby said, for your grandfather's memory. My grandfather's memory, Caleb said slowly, is the reason I'm not taking it. One of the lawyers cleared his throat, said something about the emergency petition's hearing date, set for the following Thursday. Said it like a warning, wrapped in bureaucratic language. Caleb understood without needing it spelled out. The county's hearing was about to become the stage, where all of this got decided, one way or the other, in front of whoever chose to show up. After they left, Vernon stood looking down the empty drive a long time. Thursday, he said. That doesn't give us much room. Room for what? For me to get sworn in properly, Vernon said. For the deed to be entered as evidence the right way. Not just waved around by a lawyer hoping nobody asks hard questions. I filed that document 40 years ago with my own hand, Caleb. If I'm going to stand up in that hearing and read it aloud, I need Denise to make sure it holds up to every objection Danby's men can throw at it. They spent that week the way a person spends the days before something they can't put off. Methodically, without much sleep, running down every loose thread that might strengthen the deed's standing. Corbin tracked down the original 1974 recording ledger. The physical book Vernon had entered the filing into by hand, still sitting in a box in storage at the new courthouse annex. Its pages confirmed the same parcel number, same date, same signature. She found the county surveyor's decades-old field notes too, water-stained but legible. They'd drawn the original 62-acre boundary long before anyone split it on a digital map. Each piece alone was a fragment. Together, laid out across Corbin's desk, they built something that looked less like an old man's forgotten paperwork, more like a fortress. Wednesday night, the evening before the hearing, Caleb drove out to the drive-in alone, stood in the gravel lot as the sun went down. The screen tower's crooked shadow stretched long across that ground. 6 weeks now, it had quietly held 62 acres nobody in town knew were his. He thought about his grandfather at that same card table, 40 years earlier, telling Vernon to keep a secret until it was needed more than the money it protected. He thought about the plywood panel, the welded box, the brass key, the index card in careful block print, each one a small, patient act of faith. In a grandson Wendell Winters would not live to see grow into the man who'd need it. Tomorrow, Caleb said out loud. To no one. The way he'd started talking to the empty lot more and more these past weeks. Tomorrow we find out if 40 years holds. He slept in the truck one more night, same as always. But for the first time since the estate sale, it didn't feel like a man with nowhere else to go. It felt like a man keeping watch over something worth guarding. Denise Corbin's office smelled like old paper and peppermint tea. The first time Caleb sat across from her desk, he found himself doing the same nervous math he'd done his whole life, adding up what an hour of a lawyer's time probably cost and subtracting it from the $31 he'd started this whole thing with. "I'm not going to be able to pay you much," he told her, straight out. Before she could even open the deed folder Vernon had brought along, maybe nothing for a while, Corbin looked at him a long moment over her reading glasses. "Mr. Winters," she said, "I've been practicing law in this county for 22 years. I know exactly how this works. If that deed holds, and I believe it will, you'll be one of the largest landowners in this end of the state. Inside of a month. I'll take a contingency on the recovered value, same as I would with anybody else in your position. You won't owe me a dime up front." She almost smiled. "Consider it a bet. I've made worse ones." Caleb hadn't expected that. He'd expected to be turned away. The way he'd been turned away from 2 other lawyers' offices in Barberville before Patricia sent him here. Men who'd looked at his work boots and his truck through the window and decided the math wasn't worth their time. Corbin never once looked at his boots. She read the deed properly for the first time that same afternoon. Slow. Twice through. And then she asked Vernon question after question. What year the parcel numbering changed. Whether the surveyor's original field note still existed anywhere. Whether Wendell had ever paid property taxes on the full 62 acres, or only ever the visible 12. Vernon answered each one carefully, the way a man answers when he understands that the wrong word in the wrong order could cost somebody everything. He paid taxes on 12, Vernon said. Every year. But there's a reason for that too. The county never billed him for the other 50, because the county's own records only ever showed the 12. He wasn't hiding 62 acres from the taxman. The taxman never knew to ask. That actually helps us, Corbin said, writing something down. If he'd been paying taxes on land the county's own records said didn't exist under his name, that would raise questions. This way, it's consistent. The county's error, not his deception. It was during that same meeting that Corbin first mentioned the words contingency, title insurance, quiet title action, words that meant nothing to Caleb, and everything to the next 6 weeks of his life. She explained them patient as a school teacher, broke each one down into plain pieces. Caleb found himself taking notes on the back of an old work order from a roofing job. It was the only paper he had in his pocket. The most important thing, Corbin said, near the end of that first meeting, is that we move faster than Danby does. Right now, you have a strong claim and no urgency. He has weak footing and enormous urgency. That balance can flip if we sit still. Every day we wait is a day his lawyers spend building a defence we haven't seen yet. Caleb drove back to the drive-in that evening, turning all of it over. The contingency, the quiet title action, 62 acres sitting quiet under a screen tower nobody had looked at twice in 30 years. He thought about how strange it was. A piece of paper older than his own father could sit forgotten in a drawer for 50 years. Then, in the space of one afternoon, rearrange the entire shape of his life. Vernon was waiting when he got back, same as always, thermos in hand, sitting on the tailgate of his own truck in the gravel lot. "She take the case?" Vernon asked. "Contingency," Caleb said. "No money up front." Vernon nodded slow, like that confirmed something he'd already suspected about Denise Corbin. "She's a good one," he said. "Handled my sister's estate dispute years back. When our cousins tried to claim the family plot, didn't have clear title either. Different story, same shape. She doesn't take cases she doesn't believe in. Contingency tells you she believes in this one." "She said we need to move fast," Caleb said. "Faster than Danby." "Then we move fast," Vernon said. He stood up off the tailgate, joints complaining the way they always did. Looked out at the gravel lot like he was already counting the hours until the next thing needed doing. "Your grandfather waited 40 years for this moment, Caleb. I don't intend to let it slip away now, for lack of hurrying." The morning after the estate sale, before Vernon's truck ever came up the drive, Caleb woke to a text from his cousin Marla, the same second cousin whose comment about weeds had carried across the auction room the day before, though she hadn't been the one who said it out loud. Her message was short, cold. "Heard you actually bid on the drive-in. Hope you know what you're doing. Some of us actually wanted the money side of this family to matter for something." Caleb didn't answer it. He sat in the truck a long while that morning, phone screen lighting his face in the grey dawn. He thought about how strange that was. A family scattering so completely after one funeral. A cousin needling him about a $400 bid. Before the man in the ground was even 3 months settled, he'd grown up seeing Marla maybe twice a year, at holidays that felt more obligatory than warm. The family's version of a tax nobody enjoyed paying, but everyone paid anyway. It was Marla who filed the loudest objection once the 1974 deed became public, along with 2 other cousins who'd split the timber lot and the rental houses. Not a formal legal challenge, they had no standing to bring one. The deed named Wendell's direct line, and Caleb was the only grandchild who qualified. But a noisier campaign, carried mostly through relatives and old family friends. Whispers that Caleb had manipulated a senile old recorder into forging paperwork, or that Vernon had some angle nobody had examined. Caleb heard most of it secondhand, through Vernon, who still had friends everywhere from his decades in the recorder's office. He never confronted Marla directly. Corbyn advised against it, told him engaging with family gossip only fed it more oxygen. The deed, the ledger, and the surveyor's notes would settle it better. Better than anything he could say on a phone call laced with old resentment. She was right in the end. Once the hearing's outcome hit public record, once Meridian Logistics' withdrawal made the local paper, the Whisper campaign lost its footing. The way most Whisper campaigns do once the facts stop cooperating. Marla never apologised. Not directly, not in so many words. But she sent a second text, nearly 8 months later. 3 lines. Congratulating him on the reopening, mentioning almost as an aside that she'd heard he was hiring and did he need part-time help running the concession stand on weekends. Caleb didn't hire her, didn't need to make a point of refusing either. He just let the offer sit unanswered a week. Then, too, let it fade, the way most half-hearted olive branches do, when nobody on either end wants the harder work of rebuilding something. Some bridges, he'd decided somewhere in that long autumn, weren't worth the labour of repairing, just because the water underneath had finally calmed. What he did instead, in the place where family might once have stood, was let Vernon's circle become his own. Vernon's Thursday card game, the one Wendell used to sit in on for 20 years, absorbed Caleb without much ceremony that first winter. 4 old men and Caleb, dealing hands across a table. Vernon mentioned once, almost offhand, that it was the exact same table Wendell used to sit at. Passed down through some chain of second-hand furniture nobody quite remembered the origin of. Caleb lost more hands than he won that first year, mostly because the other 3 men had 30 years of practice, reading each other's tells that Caleb hadn't earned yet. But he kept showing up, same as he'd kept driving 40 minutes every Sunday to see Wendell. He was starting to understand something. Showing up, consistently, for people who mattered, was itself a kind of inheritance, one nobody could contest in any hearing room. Denise Corbyn remained his lawyer through all of it, though somewhere along the way it shifted into something closer to friendship, marked mostly by the fact that she stopped billing him for the small questions. A lease clause here, a tax filing there. She started just answering them over coffee at the pharmacy counter instead. She came to the reopening night in October with her husband. Watching the lot fill with cars, she told Caleb something. In 22 years of small-town property law, this was the first case that ended with her in a lawn chair under a movie screen, not filing paperwork in a courthouse basement. Most of what I do ends quiet, she said. A signature. A stamp. Nobody notices unless something goes wrong. This is the first time I got to watch the thing we fought for actually turn the lights back on. She looked over at him. The screen's glow washed pale across both their faces. Don't waste it, Caleb. Whatever you do with this place going forward, don't let it become just another asset you manage. Your grandfather didn't build it to be managed. He built it to be lived in. Caleb took that seriously enough to write it down. Later that same week, on the back of an old real rental invoice, he found cleaning out the last drawer of the filing cabinet. He tucked the note into the same metal box where his grandfather once hid, a welded lockbox and a ledger of quiet, unspoken generosity. Some legacies, he was starting to believe, worked best passed forward the same way they'd been received. Quietly. Patiently. Without much need for anybody watching to notice. None of the townspeople in that hearing room understood it. Denise Corbyn only pieced it together weeks later, through the public record. Exactly how much weight Roy Danby carried into that Thursday morning. Before Vernon Task ever opened his mouth, Danby had borrowed heavily against a Meridian Logistics deal, months before the letter of intent was even finalised. He used the projected $2.1 million sale as collateral for a bridge loan. On an unrelated commercial project 2 counties over, a strip of retail space outside Corbin, Kentucky, half leased and bleeding money since before the pandemic. That project alone owed a regional bank close to $800,000. Payments Danby had been covering barely by juggling smaller deals and personal credit lines. All of it resting on one assumption: that the Kessler Hill sale would close on schedule and clear the debt in one stroke. If the 62 acres slipped out of his hands, Danby wasn't just losing a profitable transaction. He was facing a default on the Corbin retail project, one likely to trigger cross-default clauses on 2 smaller loans he'd taken out the year before. A cascade that could cost him nearly everything he'd built over 2 decades. That was the fear sitting behind his eyes the morning he offered Caleb $11,000 for a junk heap. The same fear doubled a week later at $20,000. The same fear that made him file an emergency eminent domain petition, rather than simply wait and see whether a 26-year-old roofer with no lawyer would even think to contest an old family deed. Corbin laid all of this out for Caleb over coffee at her office, not because it changed anything about the hearing. She thought he deserved to understand. The man he was up against wasn't simply greedy in the abstract. He was drowning. He'd convinced himself of one thing: the only way to keep his head above water was to make sure nobody noticed. The ground under Caleb's inheritance was actually his own private life raft. "It doesn't excuse what he tried to do," Corbin said, "threatening you with condemnation, lowballing you twice, filing an emergency petition timed to beat your title claim. That's not desperation, that's calculation. And calculation dressed up as generosity is still calculation. But it might help you understand why he came at this so hard, so fast. A cornered man moves different than a comfortable one." Caleb turned that over a long while after she said it, sitting in the truck outside her office, engine off, watching the square go about its ordinary Tuesday business. He thought about the $11,000 and the $20,000. Understood now that each number wasn't a measure of the land's value at all. It was a measure of exactly how much Danby feared losing, if the deal fell through. He thought too, uncomfortably, about how close he'd come to needing that $11,000 badly enough to take it, if the drive-in had turned out to be nothing more than what everyone assumed. He didn't tell Vernon the financial specifics right away. It felt private. A man's fear laid bare in bank records. Nobody but a lawyer had business reading. But a few days later, cards dealt on Vernon's porch. He mentioned that Danby's urgency had never really been about Caleb at all. "Some men build their whole life, balanced on one deal, closing on schedule," Vernon said, considering his hand, not looking up. "Your grandfather used to say that was the difference between building something with your hands and building something on paper. A wall you build stands whether or not the bank calls tomorrow. A deal you build on paper comes apart the second the wrong person asks the wrong question, at the wrong hearing. You think Danby ever builds anything with his hands?" Vernon almost laughed. "I think Roy Danby's hands haven't touched a shovel since before you were born, if they ever did at all." He laid down a card, unhurried. That was always going to be his weakness, sooner or later. A man like that has no wall standing anywhere that isn't held up by somebody else's signature. Sooner or later, somebody stops signing. The Piney Fork County building had one room big enough for a hearing like this. Same room used for school board meetings, the occasional zoning fight, rows of folding chairs under fluorescent light. A raised table up front, 3 county commissioners flanked by a court reporter. Nobody in town had seen work this hard in years. By the time Caleb arrived with Denise Corbin, the room was already half full. More people kept filing in behind them, drawn by the particular gravity small towns reserve for anything that smells like a real fight. Roy Danby sat at the front table opposite Caleb, flanked by 2 Lexington attorneys. A leather folio sat open in front of him, thick enough to bury the proceedings in paperwork, if persuasion alone didn't carry the day. Different collared shirt than the one from the gravel lot. Pressed. A wristwatch that caught the fluorescent light every time he checked it, which was often. Vernon sat in the front row on Caleb's side. A manila folder sat in his lap. The 1974 deed. The recording ledger. The surveyor's field notes. each one protected in a clear plastic sleeve. Corbin had insisted on that. One hand rested flat on top of the folder the whole time, the way a man rests a hand on something he doesn't intend to let anyone take from him. The commission chair, a heavy-set man named Harlan Pruitt, who ran the feed store on weekdays, called the hearing to order, read the petition into the record, an emergency request from Danby Development Group to expedite an eminent domain review of the Kessler Hill access road, structural deficiency, public safety concerns. Timed, though Pruitt didn't say this part aloud, to close before any competing claim to the underlying land could be heard. Danby's lead attorney rose first, spoke for nearly 20 minutes. Smooth, practiced, engineering reports on the road's condition, county code sections on substandard access, a dangerous, neglected road that endangered anyone who used it and needed the county's intervention regardless of who held title. It was, Caleb thought, listening to it unfold, a genuinely convincing performance. If you didn't already know what it was built to hide. When Corbin rose, she didn't argue the road's condition at all. She simply said one thing. Before the commission could rule on eminent domain over a parcel, it needed to settle who actually held clear title. A road couldn't be condemned out from under an owner nobody had properly identified. And commissioners, Corbin said, we intend to show that Mr. Danby's own pending sale and the 4 years of parcel acquisitions underlying it rest on a fundamental error about the size and ownership of this tract. We call Vernon Task. Vernon rose slow, the folder held against his chest. He walked to the small witness table beside the commissioner's bench. The court reporter's fingers paused over her keys, waiting. The room went quiet in the particular way rooms go quiet when everyone senses that whatever happens next will matter. State your name and former position for the record, Corbin said. Vernon Earl Task, County Recorder of Deeds for this county, 39 years. Retired 11 years ago. In your capacity as recorder, did you personally file a deed in October of 1974 concerning a parcel known locally as the Kessler Hill tract? I did. Would you read that deed's legal description into the record now? In full. Vernon opened the folder. Caleb watched Danby's attorneys exchange a glance. Quick. The first flicker of real uncertainty either of them had shown all morning. Vernon unfolded the brittle paper, same careful hands he'd used in the dusty annex 2 weeks before, and began to read, slow, deliberate. His voice carried into every corner of the room without needing to be raised. He read the parcel description, word for word. The metes and bounds, the reference points tying the drive-in's 12 visible acres to 62 acres running east along Kessler Hill to the county line. The notarization, the date, the signature of Wendell Winters, affixed beneath it all. When he finished, he set the deed down flat on the table and looked directly at Roy Danby, for the first time since he'd sat down. This deed was never superseded, Vernon said, never subdivided by Mr. Winters, never resurveyed to split the visible parcel from the larger tract. When the county migrated its records to a digital system in the 90s, this document was never flagged for that migration. An oversight, not a legal act. And it remains to this day the only fully executed and controlling deed to this land. One of Danby's attorneys was on his feet immediately, objecting, calling the document's authenticity into question, suggesting it could be a forgery decades in the making, suggesting Vernon Task had a personal motive, a young man he'd clearly grown fond of. Corbin was ready for exactly this. She produced the original 1974 recording ledger, the physical book with Vernon's own handwritten entry logged on the correct date, cross-referenced against the county's own microfilm backup. A copy Patricia Ordway had pulled and certified that same week. This isn't Mr. Task's word alone, Corbin said, holding the ledger up so the commissioners could see it. This is the county's own independent record, made the same year, by the county's own recorder, confirmed against microfilm the county has kept in cold storage for 50 years. If this is a forgery, it's a forgery this county committed against itself in 1974, for reasons nobody can explain. Danby's face had gone a shade paler than it was 20 minutes earlier. His hand resting on the leather folio had gone very still. The room had started to lean forward, collectively, the particular attentive stillness of an audience that senses the story is about to turn. Mr. Danby, Corbin said, turning to address him directly across the room, you've entered into a pre-sale letter of intent with Meridian Logistics for the full 62-acre tract, dated 7 weeks ago, for $2.1 million. Would you care to explain to this commission how you came to represent yourself as capable of conveying clear title to land that, by the county's own controlling deed, has never once left the Winters family? The question landed in the room like a dropped plate. Somewhere behind Caleb, a woman gasped out loud. The murmuring that followed rolled across the folding chairs like a wave finding shore. Danby's attorney rose again, said something about needing a recess to consult with his client. But Harlan Pruitt, feed store owner and reluctant chairman, was already looking at Danby, flat, unimpressed, like a man who just watched somebody try to sell him a truck with a rebuilt title. "We'll take 15 minutes, Pruitt said. "But Mr. Danby, I'll tell you plain, this commission is not in the business of condemning a road out from under an owner whose title just got read into our own record by our own former recorder, holding our own ledger book. You might want to use that 15 minutes to think hard about what you actually came here to do today." The 15 minutes stretched to nearly 30. Caleb sat in the folding chair, hands flat on his knees, watching Danby huddle with his attorneys near the back exit, their voices low and urgent. One lawyer gestured sharply at a phone screen, pulling up documents in real time, trying to find some angle that hadn't already collapsed under a 50-year-old ledger book. Vernon sat back down beside Caleb. The folder returned to his lap. For the first time since the hearing began, he allowed himself something close to a smile. "I've waited 40 years to say those words out loud in a room like this," he said quietly. "Didn't expect it would feel like setting down a weight I didn't know I was still carrying." "You did right by him," Caleb said. "By both of us." "I did what he asked," Vernon said. "There's a difference, but I'll take either one, today." When Pruitt gavelled the hearing back into session, Danby's lead attorney rose first. His voice had lost the smooth, unhurried confidence from 20 minutes earlier. He asked for a continuance, framed it as due diligence, time to properly review the newly entered evidence before any ruling. Corbin didn't fight the continuance itself. She only asked, plainly, that the commission note for the record that until title was resolved, the emergency petition for eminent domain could not proceed. You cannot condemn a road out from under an ownership question that remains legally live. Pruitt agreed without much deliberation. "Petitions tabled," he said, "pending resolution of the title dispute now properly before the county recorder's office. And Mr. Danby, I'd strongly suggest you and your legal team take a hard look at whatever other parcels you've represented as clear and clean these last 4 years. Because if this deed holds, and I've got no reason today to think it won't, you may have a bigger problem than one road." It was not, Caleb would think later, the thunderclap ending. The kind he might have imagined, lying in that gravel lot the night before. No gasp of vindication. No gavel slamming down on a final verdict. It was smaller than that, and stranger, and somehow more satisfying. A room full of Piney Fork's own residents. Watching a man who'd spent 4 years quietly buying up their neighbour's land at scrub value prices, told in front of all of them that his own paperwork had just come apart at the seams. Danby left without speaking to anyone. His attorneys trailed him out the side door. The black pickup peeled out faster than the speed limit allowed. Nobody in that room felt much urge to report it. What came in the weeks that followed arrived the unglamorous, procedural way real consequences usually do. Patricia Ordway's office formally refiled the 1974 deed under the county's modern parcel numbering system, correcting 50 years of a clerical gap in a single afternoon of paperwork that felt, to Caleb, almost anticlimactic given everything it settled. The Meridian Logistics deal collapsed within the week. Their own legal department pulled out the moment word reached them. The seller couldn't actually convey clear title to more than a fifth of what he'd promised. Danby's letter of intent, once produced in the hearing as evidence of the parcel's true value, became public record. Within a month, 3 other Kessler cousins who'd sold pieces of land to Danby over the previous 4 years came forward with their own lawyers, asking hard questions about what exactly he'd told them their scrub acreage was worth at the time of sale. The county attorney opened a formal inquiry into those earlier transactions before the season turned. A slow-moving process that would take the better part of a year to resolve. But it started, in every material way, the afternoon Vernon task read a 50-year-old deed into a public record. in a room full of Danby's own neighbours. Caleb didn't sell the land. Corbyn had warned him early he'd have offers, and she was right. Developers from 3 counties over called within days of the story, making the local paper. Each one offering more than the last. Each one a version of the same $11,000 lowball, dressed up in a nicer suit. Caleb turned every one of them down without much deliberation. He hadn't fought this hard for that. Hadn't sat in a dusty annex watching an old man's handshake as he unfolded a 50-year secret. Not to trade it all away to the next version of Roy Danby, just because the number had more zeros in it. What he did instead took most of a year. Every dollar the 62 acres could responsibly generate along the way, he leased 18 acres to a construction crew doing highway shoulder work, banked the income, used it to repair the drive-in itself. First the roof over the concession stand, then the screen tower, jacked back to true by a crew Vernon knew from his card-playing days. Men who'd worked construction their whole lives and did the job at cost because Wendell Winters had once done them a kindness nobody else remembered. Vernon came out most days that year, sometimes to help, sometimes just to sit on an overturned crate and watch, thermos in hand, offering an opinion on paint colour or projector wiring, whether anyone asked or not. He became, without either of them ever naming it out loud, something between an uncle and a foreman. The steady presence Caleb had never quite had growing up. Caleb found himself driving those same 40 minutes he used to drive to visit Wendell, except now it was 15 minutes to Vernon's porch on a Thursday evening. Cards dealt across the same kind of table his grandfather used to sit at. An old habit inherited without either of them planning it. Caleb drove out to the Piney Fork Baptist Church Cemetery the morning after the hearing. He hadn't planned to. He just found himself turning the truck onto that road instead of back toward the drive-in, like his hands knew something his mind hadn't caught up to yet. Wendell's headstone was plain granite, no more elaborate than any other stone in that quiet field. Wendell Earl Winters. The dates. Nothing else. Caleb had picked it out himself, 11 weeks before any of this started, from a catalogue at the funeral home. It was the one that looked like something Wendell would have chosen for somebody else, never once for himself. Caleb crouched down in the wet morning grass and set one hand flat against the top of the stone, the way you'd rest a hand on a shoulder. "We won," he said out loud. Quiet. The cemetery was empty except for him, and a mockingbird working through its whole repertoire in a nearby oak. Vernon read it into the record. Whole room heard it. Danby about swallowed his own tongue. He didn't cry saying it. He'd done most of his crying 11 weeks earlier, a different part of this same cemetery. Standing over a fresh mound of red Kentucky clay, while a preacher he barely knew read words that didn't fit the man they were about. This felt different. Less like grief and more like a report. Like checking in with somebody who'd been waiting a long time to hear how a job turned out. "I keep thinking about the ledger," Caleb said. "The one with RF on it. You never told anybody. Not even Vernon. 40 years of paying a man's medical bills. You never once let him thank you for it." He paused a long while, watched the mockingbird shift branches. "I don't know if I can be that quiet about the good I do. I don't know if anybody can anymore. But I'm going to try." He stayed maybe 10 more minutes, not saying much else, just sitting in the wet grass, hand on the stone, while the sun climbed higher over the tree line. Then he stood, brushed the damp from his knees and drove back to the drive-in. Vernon was already waiting in the gravel lot with the thermos, same as every morning, like he'd known exactly where Caleb had gone, and exactly how long it would take him to come back ready to keep working. "You all right?" Vernon asked, handing him the cup. "Yeah," Caleb said, and meant it, in a way he hadn't quite managed to mean it since the auction. Just had to tell him something. Vernon didn't ask what. Some things don't need asking. A man learns that after enough Thursday nights across a card table from somebody. He just nodded, the same slow nod he'd given Caleb that first morning. The two of them stood there a while longer, coffee steaming in the cool air, looking out at 62 acres that had waited 40 years to matter, and had finally, quietly, started to. Roy Danby's collapse, when it came slow, then all at once. Then all the way these things tend to for a man who's spent a career convincing people that confidence and solvency are the same thing. The county attorney's inquiry took 8 months to reach any formal conclusion, but word of it moved through Piney Fork far faster than any court filing could, and word in a town this size was its own kind of verdict. Two of the Kessler cousins settled quietly, accepted a corrected payment once their scrub value sales were reassessed against the land's true worth. A third refused to settle at all and took Danby to civil court over misrepresentation, a case that dragged through the following spring, cost him legal fees that ate into reserves he'd been counting on to weather the Meridian collapse. His office in Lexington, once staffed with 6 people, was down to 2 by the following winter. The black pickup with the showroom shine sat, by then, with a small dent in the rear bumper nobody bothered fixing. The kind of detail Caleb noticed, only because he still remembered exactly how it looked, pulling out of the gravel lot that first morning. Temper in the tyres. Danby did not go bankrupt. Not entirely. Not in the dramatic way a story might want. He kept the office. Kept a smaller version of the business. Modest residential deals, 2 rungs down from where he used to operate. Careful now. Chastened, in a way that showed mostly in how quietly he moved through town. No longer the man who arrived places expecting the room to defer to him. Caleb saw him once at the Dollar General, nearly a year after the hearing, both of them reaching for the same aisle at the same moment. Danby looked at him a long beat, something unreadable working behind his eyes. Then he simply nodded. Once, walked on without a word. It wasn't forgiveness. Caleb didn't offer it. Danby didn't ask for it. But it was, in its way, the quietest kind of acknowledgement a proud man could manage. Caleb decided that was enough. He didn't need Roy Danby's contrition to feel like the last year had been worth what it cost him. He had 62 acres, a screen tower standing true again, an old man's friendship he hadn't known to hope for a year earlier. The Kessler cousins turned out to be a stranger source of grace than Caleb expected. Once the corrected payments came through, 2 of them drove out unannounced one Saturday. A brother and sister named Adele and June Kessler. People Caleb had never met before that spring. A casserole dish in hand, and an apology neither of them owed him personally. "We should have known your grandfather better," Odell said, standing awkward in the gravel lot. Dish held out like an offering. "Should have visited. Should have known what kind of man builds something like this, and waits 40 years to let it matter." He looked past Caleb at the drive-in, screen tower catching the afternoon light. Concession stand roof finally sound again. "This is good work you're doing out here." "It's his work," Caleb said. "I'm just finishing it." June, quieter than her brother, added only, he'd have liked seeing it finished by somebody who loved him enough to sleep in a truck on his account. She didn't say anything else. Caleb found he didn't need her to. By early autumn, the drive-in snack bar had a working popcorn machine again. Second-hand, bought with money from the highway shoulder lease. Vernon had taken to fixing it every time it jammed, with the same patient, unhurried competence he brought to everything, muttering under his breath about how machines from this era were built to last, and modern ones weren't built to be fixed at all. He'd started bringing his own thermos less often, because Caleb kept a pot going in the newly repaired concession stand now. An old percolator Vernon himself had found at an estate sale 2 towns over, and refused to let Caleb pay him back for. The screen itself took longest to restore, the projection equipment older than either of them by decades. It was Vernon, in the end, who tracked down a man 3 counties over who still repaired the old carbon arc projectors. A dying trade, even among men who specialised in dying trades. It took another 6 weeks, and money Caleb didn't quite have, covered in the end by a loan Corbyn arranged against the land's now undisputed value. Backed by a bank that, only a year earlier, wouldn't have loaned Caleb Winters the price of a used truck. Through all of it, Caleb kept working roofing jobs on the side. Not because he needed to anymore, not strictly. But some habits don't let go easy. There was a particular satisfaction in checking a 19-year-old kid's harness twice on a job site. Same as he always had. Knowing now he could afford to walk away from any crew that told him not to bother. He never did walk away from one. He just kept checking the harness. Quietly. The way his grandfather had once quietly welded a box shut and told a friend to keep a promise for 40 years. Some things about a man, Caleb was starting to understand, didn't change just because his bank account finally did. Winter came hard that year, harder than the county had seen in some time. It was during those cold months that Caleb learned the slower parts of holding 62 acres, not just winning the right to keep them. Long after the hearing had faded from being the thing everyone at the Dollar General talked about, there were surveys to commission, a proper modern one this time, so the county's digital parcel map could finally be corrected to match the 1974 deed. rather than the fractured guess it had operated on for 30 years. There were back taxes to settle too, on the 50 acres never assessed correctly, once the original split occurred. A bill that ran higher than Caleb expected. He covered it, in the end, by selling a small strip along the county road frontage to the highway department outright. The surveyor's fair market assessment made the price plain. Roughly 40 times what the county tax rolls had once listed the entire 12 visible acres as being worth. There were also, more quietly, the ordinary griefs of a man learning to live inside a windfall he'd never expected. Some weeks he found himself oddly uncomfortable, buying groceries without counting the total, twice in his head first. An old habit that didn't die just because his bank balance finally allowed it to. He kept the Ranger long after Corbin gently suggested the cracked windshield probably ought to get fixed. When he finally did replace it, sometime around January, he felt a strange pang of loss, standing in the shop parking lot, looking at the clean, unbroken glass. Like some part of the man who'd bid $400 on a lot full of weeds was being quietly retired along with the crack. He talked to Vernon about that feeling one cold Thursday night. Cards dealt between them on the porch, breath fogging in the unheated air, because Vernon refused to run the space heater until December, no matter how his knees complained about it. "You're grieving the version of yourself that had nothing," Vernon said. Like it was the most obvious thing in the world, which maybe to a man who'd lived 71 years and buried a wife and kept a 40-year secret, it was. "That's not weakness, son. That's just what happens when a hard season ends. Doesn't mean you miss the hardship. Means you're not sure yet who you are without it defining you." "Who am I then?" Caleb asked. Half joking, mostly not. Vernon considered his cards a long moment before he answered. "You're the man who checked a 19-year-old's harness twice on a roof job. The same morning you had $400 to your name and a truck for a bed," he said. "That didn't change because the acreage did. You just get to find out now what that kind of man does when he's not scared all the time. Give it a year, you'll know yourself better than you do tonight." He was right, though it took closer to a year than Caleb expected. By spring, Caleb had hired 2 men full-time to help finish the renovation work. One of them the same 19-year-old whose harness he'd checked twice the morning of the auction. A kid named Dustin Farley, who'd been bouncing between roofing crews same as Caleb once had. No steady work, no particular prospects. Until Caleb offered him something permanent, and Dustin took it without asking twice. Caleb paid him fair, checked his harness out of old habit, even now that neither of them strictly needed the work. Found some quiet satisfaction in being, for once, the kind of employer who didn't ask a man to cut a corner for $15 extra. He also, that spring, finally accepted Vernon's standing offer of the spare room, not because the truck had become uninhabitable, but because Vernon's knees had started giving him real trouble on the porch steps in icy weather. Caleb figured a man ought to be close enough to help an old friend before help was urgently needed, not after. He kept the truck anyway, parked in Vernon's gravel drive most nights. An old, stubborn piece of continuity he wasn't ready to let go of, even as everything else about his life reorganized itself around a stability he still sometimes had trouble believing was real. The drive in itself came together slower than either of them expected, slower than Caleb wanted, but steadily. The way real things tend to get built, when nobody's in a hurry to fake their way through it. The concession stand's roof went up first, sound and tight, the popcorn machine humming reliably by midsummer. The screen tower took longest, jacked true by degrees over 3 separate weekends. A crew that treated the work less like a job and more like an act of restitution. To a man most of them remembered fondly, and had, in their own quiet ways, felt guilty about not helping sooner. By August, word had gotten around the county that the Kessler Hill Drive-In was coming back. Caleb started fielding questions he'd never expected to field. A film distributor 2 states over, wondering about licensing terms. A local church group, asking whether they could rent the lot for a youth event. An antique dealer in Lexington offered an absurd sum for the old carbon arc projector housing. Caleb turned it down flat. Some things he'd come to understand weren't for sale, regardless of the number attached. Dustin Farley told the story of that first harness check often enough. In the years that followed, it became something like a small local legend, passed along at lunch breaks the way old-timers once passed along stories about Wendell's own quiet generosities. Guy had $400 to his name, Dustin would say, usually to whichever new hire had just joined a crew, and needed the lesson more than the entertainment. And he still stopped what he was doing to double-check my rig. Because the foreman wanted us moving faster than the roof pitch allowed. Didn't know the man from Adam. Just saw a 19-year-old about to take a bad risk for $15 extra. Decided that wasn't happening on his watch. Gary Combs never did apologise for the docked pay. Caleb never asked him to. But word travels in small counties the way water travels downhill, following whatever path costs it least resistance. Within a year of the drive-ins reopening, Gary Combs found his own crew shrinking. Word got around among younger roofers about which foreman valued their safety and which valued their schedule more. Caleb didn't engineer that outcome. He never spoke publicly against Gary Combs, never held a grudge loud enough for anyone to notice. He simply kept being the kind of employer, once he had crews of his own, who checked harnesses without being asked. Never once cut $15 from a man's pay for insisting on 90 extra seconds of caution. The county, in its own slow and unhurried way, noticed the difference, adjusted its loyalties accordingly. It was Vernon who pointed this out to him one Thursday evening. Cards dealt between them, the two of them working through the kind of comfortable quiet that had become the backbone of their friendship. "You know what your grandfather used to say about men like Gary Combs?" Vernon said, not looking up from his hand. Said the world doesn't punish men like that directly. Not usually. Not with lightning bolts or ruined lives. It just quietly stops sending them good workers, one crew at a time, until they're standing on a roof alone, wondering where everybody went. Slow justice. The only kind that mostly ever actually happens. He laid down a card, unhurried. Man like that never even notices it happening to him. Just wakes up one day short-handed and blames the economy. Caleb thought about that a long while after Vernon said it, turning it over the way he'd turned over so many of the old man's small offhand observations across that same card table. Somewhere in the quiet of that Thursday evening, he decided something. It was probably the truest description he'd ever heard of how the whole last year had actually unfolded. Not a lightning bolt striking Roy Danby down in one dramatic hearing room moment. A slow, patient, unglamorous kind of justice. The paperwork simply catching up, one overdue reckoning at a time. To men who had spent years assuming nobody was keeping count, there was one more discovery. Smaller than the deed, smaller even than the ledger of quiet payments to Russell Farmer. Caleb didn't stumble onto it until the following spring, nearly a full year after the auctioneer's laugh had started all of it. He was clearing out the last of the storage shed behind the concession stand, a lean-to structure he'd put off tackling, because it held nothing but rusted equipment and what he'd assumed was decades of ordinary junk. Wedged behind a stack of old speaker poles, he found a coffee can sealed with electrical tape. Heavier than a coffee can had any business being. Inside, wrapped in a plastic grocery bag gone brittle with age, sat a stack of silver dollars. 41 of them. Beneath the coins, folded small, another note in his grandfather's careful block print. For whoever finds this and needs it more than the coins are worth, count them twice. Some things in this life are worth exactly what they say they are, and some things are worth more than you'll ever be told outright. Learn to tell the difference, and you'll do fine. Caleb sat on an overturned bucket a long while. 41 silver dollars spread across his palm. He thought about how many tiers this one man had built into a single piece of ground. A plywood panel, a welded box, a brass key, a drawer in a forgotten annex, a ledger of quiet debts repaid. And now this, a coffee can of coins that meant almost nothing in raw dollar value, and everything in what it represented. A man who spent his whole life building small, patient proofs that somebody, somewhere, had thought ahead on your behalf. He didn't spend the coins, he had the frame shop in town build a shadow box for them instead, mounted beside the black and white photograph of Wendell at the drive-in's original opening night. He hung it in the concession stand, across from the register, close enough that Vernon could see it. Every Thursday evening he came by to check the popcorn machine. Count them twice. Vernon read the note over Caleb's shoulder the day he found it. Something in his voice cracked, just slightly. The first time in nearly a year Caleb had heard the old man's composure slip that much. That's the same thing he used to say to me at the card table. 40 years running. Count your hand twice before you bet it. I always thought he meant poker. Maybe he did, Caleb said. Maybe he meant both. Vernon didn't answer that. Just stood looking at the shadow box a long moment, coins catching the concession stand's fluorescent light. Then he said, quiet, mostly to himself. He was still teaching me things a year after he died. I don't know many men who manage that. Caleb thought about that conversation often. Through a second summer of Saturday showings that drew steadier crowds than the first. Through a second winter, spent mostly at Vernon's place, cards dealt across the same table. Through the slow, ordinary business of turning a piece of land everyone once called worthless into something that quietly supported two men's lives and a small circle of others who drifted into their orbit along the way. Dustin Farley, learning the projection booth's equipment well enough to run a full show alone. Carol Doss, showing up most autumn Saturdays with her own thermos. Patricia Ordway's teenagers, claiming the same patch of gravel near the concession stand every single week, like it had become theirs by right of habit. None of it ever felt to Caleb like the ending a story usually promises. The triumphant final beat where every loose thread ties off clean. Marla never fully made amends. Roy Danby never offered anything close to a real apology. Just that single silent nod outside the Dollar General. Caleb decided to accept it as enough. Demanding more would have cost him something he wasn't willing to spend. Wendell was still dead. 11 weeks gone before any of this started, and permanently gone now. No amount of recovered acreage brought that back. No restored screen tower. Not one Sunday afternoon Caleb might have spent talking with him, instead of sitting quiet while the old man's hands shook too badly to hold a fork. But there was, in all of it, a particular kind of peace Caleb hadn't expected to find. Waiting inside a 12-acre lot, everyone in the county had once agreed was worth nothing. Not the peace of a debt fully settled. Some debts, he was learning, didn't settle so much as they simply stopped demanding payment. Something quieter than that. The peace of a man who'd spent his whole life checking other people's harnesses twice. Refusing the corner somebody else was willing to cut. Finally handed solid evidence that the habit had been worth keeping all along, by a grandfather patient enough to wait 40 years for exactly this grandson. Almost a year after the hearing, a woman named Carol Doss showed up at the drive-in unannounced. She introduced herself as Russell Farmer's granddaughter. She'd heard, through a cousin of a cousin, that the Kessler Hill property was back in the news, that somebody was asking old-timers around the county about a projectionist named RF from the 70s. My grandfather passed in 2003, Carol said, standing awkward in the gravel lot, much the way Odell Kessler had stood there with his casserole dish. He never talked much about his hand, or the accident. But my grandmother used to say a cheque came every year around Christmas for as long as she could remember, from a man she never met, never explained, never once questioned, because it kept food on the table 3 winters running when my grandfather couldn't work steady. She always wondered who it was. Died wondering, actually. I only just now put the pieces together, hearing this property was back running. Caleb showed her the ledger page, the column of dates and figures in his grandfather's own hand. He watched something settle in Carol Doss's face, the same thing that had settled in his own, the day Vernon first explained what the page actually meant. He never told anybody, Caleb said. Not even Vernon here, and Vernon knew him better than almost anybody alive. Some men are like that, Carol said. Quiet. My grandmother used to say the ones who need the least credit are usually the ones who did the most good. I always thought that was just something old women say, to feel better about a hard life. Guess she meant it literal. She stayed only 20 minutes, but she left with a copy of the ledger page, one Caleb made for her at the library in town. She came back the following October for the drive-in's first full season of regular Saturday showings, sitting in a lawn chair near the concession stand with a thermos of her own, watching a screen lit up for the first time in decades, honouring in her own quiet way a debt her family had never known existed, until a stranger's grandson went looking for it. Patricia Ordway kept a small memento from the whole affair for herself. She mentioned it to Caleb only once, nearly 2 years after the hearing, standing in line at the same Dollar General where the auctioneer's joke had first travelled through town. She'd kept a photocopy of Draw 14's brittle index tab, Winters W. Aim, Kessler Hill Tract, 1974, framed to small, hung in her own office at the courthouse annex, not as a trophy exactly. A reminder, she said, of the exact kind of oversight her office existed to catch and correct. Every clerk who comes through that office after me is going to hear this story, she told Caleb. Not because it's dramatic, because it's useful. Somewhere in every county in this country, there's probably another Draw 14 sitting quiet, waiting on the right grandson or granddaughter to go looking for it. Most clerks never think to look twice at an old parcel number just because the computer says the file doesn't exist anymore. She'd pushed, in the 2 years since, for the county to audit every pre-digitisation deed. Everyone still sitting uncatalogued in the annex's drawers. A tedious project. It turned up, eventually, 4 more minor discrepancies. Nothing on the scale of the Kessler Hill tract, but enough small corrections, a mismarked boundary here, a forgotten easement there, that the county commission eventually approved funding for a part-time archivist position, just to finish the work. Patricia liked to say, telling the story to newer clerks, that Caleb Winters had accidentally modernised half a century of the county's paper trail, just by refusing to take $11,000 for a parking lot full of weeds. Caleb heard that version second-hand, embellished a little more each time it travelled. He never corrected it much. By then he understood something, though. A story told often enough in a small town stops belonging entirely to the person who lived it. It starts belonging, a little, to everyone who repeats it, each teller shaping it toward whatever lesson they most needed it to carry. For Patricia, it was a lesson about vigilance and unglamorous paperwork. For Dustin Farley, a lesson about checking your harness even when nobody's watching. For Vernon, quietly, it was something closer to absolution. 40 years of a kept promise, finally justified by the grandson who turned out to be exactly the man Wendell always said he'd become. For Caleb himself, the story felt smaller than any of those versions, and larger too. Some evenings he stood alone in the projection booth, long after a Saturday crowd had gone home. The gravel lot sat empty under a sky full of stars. A bigger town's lights would have washed out entirely. It was simply the story of a man who'd shown up every Sunday for 6 years, expecting nothing in return. Trusted with the one thing that could finally prove the showing up had counted. By an old man patient enough to wait until the trust mattered most. He kept the auctioneer's gavel-full moment in his memory, clearer than almost anything else from that whole year. Clearer even than the hearing itself, the particular sound of the crowd's laughter, the woman's voice carrying just loud enough to be heard, boys inheriting weeds and calling it a win. He didn't resent the memory anymore. Some nights, closing up the concession stand, he found himself almost grateful for it, counting the night's modest earnings into the register his grandfather had once stood behind for 31 years. It meant everyone who'd laughed that day had been there to watch, a year later, exactly how wrong they'd been. The screen was never the point, Wendell had told Vernon. More than once. At a card table neither of them fully understood the weight of at the time. Caleb understood it now, standing in the dark some nights, the projector humming warm under his palm. A crowd of cars filling the lot below, headlights off, faces turned up toward the light. The screen had never been the point. It had only ever been the thing people looked at, while they sat, without knowing it, on top of everything that actually mattered. They set the date for the first Saturday in October. Cool enough by then for a jacket, but not so cold a person's teeth would chatter sitting out under an open sky for 3 hours. Caleb didn't advertise it much. A hand-lettered sign at the Dollar General. A mention at the Piney Fork Baptist Church Wendell used to pass twice a week. Word carried mostly the old way, mouth to mouth. The way most things that mattered in a town this size still travelled. He'd wondered the week before whether anybody would actually come. 30 years was a long time for a place to sit dark. Long enough that most people who remembered it as a living thing, not just a rumour about weeds and a leaning tower, were already deep into their 60s and 70s. Same generation as Vernon himself. He needn't have worried. By 7 that evening, the gravel lot was filling with cars. The same lot Caleb once slept in alone, windows down, $31 to his name. Filling the way it must have filled 30 years before Caleb was born. Trucks from the Barberville barn job. Patricia Ordway's sedan, parked crooked, her 2 teenagers already out and running toward the concession stand before she'd fully parked. Denise Corbin arrived with her husband and a folding chair of her own, waved off Caleb's offer to find her a better spot, said she'd rather sit where she could see the whole lot fill in. Odell and June Kessler came together in June's truck, brought 2 more cousins Caleb had still never met, people whose grandparents had once sold slivers of the same tract Danby had spent 4 years quietly gathering. Come now to watch what had grown back out of ground everyone once agreed was worthless. Vernon arrived early as he always did, carrying not a thermos this time, a folding chair of his own, and a bag of the same peppermints Caleb used to bring Wendell on Sunday visits. An old habit passed sideways between two men who'd never once discussed passing it. He set up near the projection booth, close enough to keep half an eye on the old carbon arc unit in case it needed him. He watched the lot fill with the particular satisfaction of a man seeing a debt finally paid in full. Caleb worked the popcorn machine himself for the first hour, refused to charge anybody who didn't insist. The light went gold, then grey, over the tree line. By then the gravel lot held more cars than it had probably seen since the actual year Clinton was president. Exactly the joke the auctioneer had made at Caleb's expense 5 months earlier. Except now it wasn't a joke at all. He climbed the little ladder into the projection booth as full dark settled in. The same booth where a raccoon had once sent him chasing after a loose plywood panel. He found the projector already warmed and ready. Vernon had come up an hour earlier to make sure of it. Without saying anything to anyone, Caleb stood there a moment, hand on the machine's worn housing, feeling the low hum of it under his palm. He thought about his grandfather standing in this exact spot for 31 years, threading reel after reel while a whole county parked their cars and watched, none of them knowing what sat quiet and patient in the ground beneath their tyres. The screen was never the point, Caleb said, quiet, mostly to himself. The words came out easier than he expected, worn smooth now from all the times he'd turned them over since that first morning, with Vernon's thermos steaming in the wet June air. Then he started the film, an old print Vernon had tracked down through a contact from his card-playing years. Nothing special. Nothing that mattered for its own sake, because the movie itself had never been the point either. What mattered was the light hitting the screen for the first time in 3 decades. The sound of a whole gravel lot of people leaning back in their seats. Some in trucks with the windows down, some on lawn chairs hauled from home, all of them turning their faces up towards something that had sat dark and forgotten, longer than most of the kids in that lot had been alive. Caleb came down from the booth once the film was running steady, found Vernon standing near the concession stand, watching the lot rather than the screen, the way a man watches something he built, rather than something he's merely enjoying. He'd have liked this, Caleb said. He built it for exactly this, Vernon said. Not the money. Not even really the acres, though I expect that'll keep you comfortable the rest of your life, if you're careful with it. He built a reason for people to come back and sit together in the dark, look at something bigger than their own troubles for 2 hours. That was always the whole of it, long before any deed ever needed reading aloud in a hearing room. Caleb looked out over the lot. The headlights turned off now, only light coming from the screen itself, and the scattering of stars starting to show overhead. He felt something settle into place that had been unsettled since the morning. An auctioneer laughed at him for raising his hand. He thought about the $400. Every bit of it he had in the world. How strange it was that the poorest bid he'd ever made in his life had bought him the richest thing he owned. He didn't say any of that out loud. Some things he was learning didn't need saying to be true. He just stood there in the dark, beside the only man in this county who'd known his grandfather's whole heart, watching a screen full of light fall across a gravel lot crowded with cars for the first time in 30 years. And let it be enough.